We are live. My name is John Paul Berg, and this is another episode of The Way Forward, a weekly podcast regarding monetary reform and Douglas social credit. So today we touched on this topic in a previous episode, but it's super relevant and it's garnering a lot of focus in Canada specifically, in all the Western nations really. And we want to look at mass migration from an economic standpoint, and more specifically from a Douglas social credit standpoint, and look to some of the causational aspects of this. So with that said, Oliver, I'll send it over to you to get us started with the topic.
Well, as you said, we did talk about this on one of the previous episodes. So uh, I'll just give a bit of background to kind of bring everybody up to speed. According to C.H. Douglas's analysis of the financial system, under the existing system, we have this recurring chronic price-income gap. So costs and prices are being generated, being built up in the course of production faster than incomes are simultaneously being distributed. And one of the main ways of compensating for this gap is economic growth. This is why you see that businesses, governments, they put so much emphasis on growth. The economy has to grow. But so few people actually stop to ask, well, why does the economy have to grow? Why is this so imperative? And it's imperative because it's one of the main ways of filling the gap. If you have growth, governments, businesses, consumers can borrow more money into existence from the banking system and can help to then compensate for the lack of consumer buying power. So that is sort of the dynamic that's going on in the background constantly. And in order for the economy to grow, one of the things that helps to support that is constant population growth. If, because of all sorts of social, cultural, economic, financial, political reasons, a country is not reproducing sufficiently in order to sustain the kind of growth that the financial system requires, then one way of compensating for that is to constantly bring in immigrants, to import people who will then, take more money out, let's say in the form of consumer loans, or who will justify government expenditures, the expansion of budgets so that you can fund schools, hospitals, roads, etc. And of course, you're also going to be having more workers and so on and so forth. So up until I'd say COVID, every Western country has been importing people to help maintain the momentum of economic growth, not because growth is, something that's needed in itself, but it's required to make the financial system work. It's required in order to help fill the gap with more and more borrowings. So that's one aspect of the problem. The other aspect of the problem is that the existing financial system, while it's structurally dishonest and it's dysfunctional, it's also centralizing wealth, power, and privilege in the hands of the banking system, right? So when you borrow, the government has to borrow, businesses borrow, consumers borrow as a way of filling this gap, you're transferring the control of policy to the banking system, and you're also of course, charging interest, compound interest on all of this long-term debt. So you end up centralizing power and wealth in the hands of a few. And at some point, those few have so much power and so much wealth that they're in a position to impose mass migration as policy for the purpose, really, of destabilizing the society. Because if you destabilize the society, you cause conflict. And if you cause conflict, then you provide a pretext for all sorts of authoritarian or even totalitarian restrictions and interferences to deal with that conflict. And that centralizes power even more. So I think from COVID, after COVID, we have seen in Canada and in many, many, many other Western countries, we've seen levels of migration which are unprecedented and really go beyond what the economy requires. This is of a different magnitude entirely, and it would seem to be serving a political function more so than an economic one. But it's still tied up with the same issues that Douglas was addressing, which is finance, the financial system.
So it's like a natural consequence of our system, the current way it is. It's kind of predicated on growth. We're not having babies anymore in Western nations. So then it's kind of natural that we would have to, in all of our systems, through all of our social systems, Canada Pension, it's all reliant on having enough people in the workforce. So by its very nature, they're going to have to bring in a lot of migrants to kind of make up for that, to compensate. But at the same time, it's like you were saying, there's that problem, reaction, solution dialectic in there. Like that's going to balkanize our country, which it has. It's going to make special interest groups that require pandering to from our political puppets. And it's a mess. It's just an absolute mess. And it's not specific to Canada. We're seeing this in all the Western nations. What are your thoughts on this, Andre?
Well, you're mentioning we're not making enough babies. The question I would ask is why? Because if you go back, I will just go back briefly. Oliver was mentioning that the financial system is dysfunctional. That's an understatement. It's a cartel. Let's not be naive. And all those central banks are under the I would say the umbrella of the Bank of International Settlement. But in 2002, one day I was walking on St. Catherine Street in Montreal, and I remember I was watching people around. I was telling myself, where does all that money come from? And that was 24 years ago. And I was telling myself, there's something I don't understand. Fast forward 2008, the financial crisis was hiding the collapse of the capitalist model. And you have the concept of the double dip. Then after that, Lehman Brothers was dropped down. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were saved, but they were deciding who they would save, which bank they would save, and which bank they would let sink. And you have the concept of double dip. Everybody thought that, okay, we bailed out the bank, no problem, everything is saved. Even Sarkozy at the time was saying, we have to moralize the capital. We have to moralize capitalism. Okay, there's no such thing as moral capitalism. It's based on predatory. And you had this concept of, we will continue to progress. And like Oliver was mentioning, filling the gap. It's quite easy. You can fill the gap with silicone or, but one day it cracks. And it cracks even more and more and more, and it's not sustainable. One thing that I can add, 2008, the political crisis, when Greece entered the European Union and books were falsified by Goldman Sachs. None other than Goldman Sachs falsified the books of the Greek economy so they could enter in the European Union. You arrive at a point where there's no moral code anymore. And if you go back to the core question of why do we have migrants, mass immigration, 2015, 1 million immigrants arrived in Germany, only 1 million. And who was paying for those immigrants? It was the German citizen, social program, higher taxes. But 2015, you look at the economy of you were looking at the economy of Germany was flourishing. Germany was the locomotive of European Union, with manufacturing products and goods. There was no conflict with Russia. They had cheap gas. Everything was, very good. Even if the European Union, the bank of the European Union Bank was trying to bail out discreetly all those national bank. It was obvious for most economists. It was obvious that the system was not working. But then the only way to sustain this model that is not sustainable is to bring more and more immigrants. But it's cheap labor, first of all, and the second part of it is you displace people and you create anxiety. You think people, they immigrate in Germany, in Canada, and now it's the same thing in Russia. You think they immigrate because they want to leave their country, they want to improve their life, but most of them, they arrive with no clue where they're going. There's no clue where they're going. And I will refer to one thing. Maybe you bring the small picture that I put. This is taken from the website of the United Nations. On the page of the website of the United Nations, you have the 2016 United Nations Pact for Migration, which I called a total oxymoron. Because first of all, when we read this, not 193 UN member states recognize the need for a comprehensive approach to human mobility and enhance cooperation at the global level. Human mobility, you displace people while at the same time you will jail native people. When I say native people, meaning people who were born on the territory, in 15-minute cities. They're both two goals that are in total opposition, yet they're pushing this. And politicians, they're just implementing this because they know that the system is falling. They know that you cannot sustain a model based on eternal death. And I was saying this in 2019. At the time, the global debt was $200,000 billion. That was in 2019. Today, I think it's 3 or 4 times this. So you have no such reason to sustain this nonsense. But of course, there's a lot of people who benefit from it. You arrive as an immigrant in another country, they give you, what was that? $95 per day to stay either in a hotel and to have food and shelter for immigrants that were arriving in Canada. Shit, it's practically $3,000 per month. Some people, they cannot even live under, they have, I think the Canadian pension plan with the supplement is about $1,200 per month, something like that. And immigrants, they were arriving without any contributing to the labor force here, and they receive immediately $3,000. Give me $3,000 multiplied by 50. So give me 150,000 ruble. I move to Russia tomorrow morning. I will have more money in Russia than I have here. I'll have healthcare. And it's the same thing in Russia, in Europe. But you fast forward 2026 and you say, wait a second, that does not work anymore. So between 2015 and 2026, people are starting to see poverty in Canada. 2 million people go to the food bank every month, while we are sending billions of dollars outside of Canada for many, many reasons, and while we are subsidizing our own demise. I'm not an advocate of painting migrants in one aspect, because in 1900, at the beginning of the 20th century, you had what we call immigration and you had assimilation. You had groups that were assimilating to their country that they were living. They were not forgetting their own culture, but they were assimilating. In 1950, 1960, we were talking about integration. And then suddenly we're talking, after Trudeau, about multiculturalism. And today, 2026, well, it's 15-minute ghettos. And it will not improve because the model is not sustainable, like Oliver mentioned. They never fill the gap. They just, it's a black hole. It's a black hole.
I thought it was especially important to bring up this topic again, just because so many people get lost in this very myopic perception of it. They focus on the immigrants and they look at the immigrants like it's like the red and the black ants in the jar. You know what I mean? We're focusing on the other ants instead of who's shaking the jar. And when you look at it, you raise some great points, Andre. Like there's an international mobility program that helps to bring in migrant laborers. I read an article. It actually came out of the UN, and it was equating Canada's temporary worker program and the international mobility program to modern day slavery. So if you can draw that corollary with slavery and the migrants, then you have to realize that working Canadians are kind of under that same slave system. It's like I frequently say, we're less like citizens of nations and more like indentured employees of corporations. And that's kind of the way that we're shifting seemingly with this public-private partnership that we're seeing all over the West. It's kind of masks off with it. With that said, Oliver, I'll throw it over to you. What are your thoughts?
I think the saddest thing, the most tragic thing about the situation is that, had we implemented Douglas social credit in Canada when we had the opportunity in the 30s, 40s, 50s, etc., what would have happened? Well, we would be filling the gap with debt-free credit distributed as a national dividend to all citizens on the one hand, and also we would be enjoying compensated prices or the national discount. And there would be no need for all this surplus, excessive government, business, and consumer debt. And of course, then there would be no need for constant growth as a means of making the economic system, making the financial system work. And we would only grow the economy if there actually was a need for the physical goods and services that would result from that growth. And if there's no need for constant growth for financial reasons, then there would be no need for constant immigration either, right? So there still might be a little bit of immigration, maybe, family reunification or bringing in highly specialized people that we can't find here, let's say, theoretically. But bringing in hundreds of thousands of people a year, it would serve no purpose economically or financially, and therefore there would be no reason for it to exist. And that would be the case not only in Canada, that would be the case in every other country in the world that was running a Douglas social credit system. So it would, Douglas social credit, if it was implemented worldwide, would make for a world of mutual respect, would make for a world of stability, would make for a world of harmony, would be a key component of neutralizing conflict and laying the ground for world peace. And part of that would involve ending these sort of artificially induced migratory flows. Most immigrants, all things being equal, if economic and political conditions in their countries were as good as or better than what they could find here, they would prefer to stay in their countries of origin. And so there's no, it's not the best of all possible worlds to be, migrating people left, right, and center in the millions. It's destabilizing, it's unnecessary, and it's not the kind of constellation that you would see in a sane, rational world under an honest financial system.
It's funny. We see all of these nationalist groups kind of rising up as a reaction to the mass migration, but none of them. You hear a lot of hyperbolous rhetoric, a lot of we'll say sensational things are being said. They're edgelording. There's a lot of they're pushing the envelope further and further, but you never hear them address the causational aspect. And that's monetary policy that facilitates it. It's the growth that our systems are predicated on. We're all serving this economy to the extent where we're eroding our own country because we have to serve the system. We have to keep, the Ponzi scheme afloat. What are your thoughts on this, Andre?
Well, Oliver was mentioning the fact that most immigrants, they would prefer to stay in their country. Let's say they have a culture, they have family, they have roots. Let's talk about roots. That's quite important. I'm not sure that people want to immigrate because they want to fulfill their desire or their future. I was telling my wife today, I said, I'm Canadian. If I go tomorrow to Russia with my wife, she's Russian from Soviet Union, and she will never be Canadian. She will never be Canadian. She's Russian, but she's a Canadian citizen. That's a nuance that I want to make. And I was telling her, it's quite funny because even now after 13 years, you always talk about Russia. Of course, you're nostalgic, and she goes, and then we go and come back. And the idea is that you cannot forget your past. That's the first point. The second point is when we think about what happened I would say from 1960 until 2000, in the turn of the century, they were depleting the pool of female worker by promoting feminism in the 60s and 70s. And then you had new feminists, I'm talking about women, who are much more educated, and they are rejecting capitalist exploitation. They understand that they were used by the system, and then they start to advocate for mass migration, which would be, in my opinion, the business model of the financial system. They're using people to maintain their model. And up to a certain point, we all fall from it. You were saying, John Paul, we are all slave of this system. So they are at different level of awareness. Some people are not aware that they are slaves. It's quite interesting when you receive $3,000 per month and you can go to the shop, you stay in a hotel, nobody asks you to work. Wow, you don't have to be in public transport or transport every day, stuck in traffic. So for them, it's the Klondike. It's incredible. And because they arrive here, then suddenly they are stuck in a ghetto. There was an example of a building where Punjab people were there. They were speaking neither French or English at all. How can you function in a society when you don't speak the language of the majority, or, for example, both official language in Canada? We are all in this together. Slave, I'm sorry, it's a class war. Slave against tenants, if we want to use this expression, landlord. And like I was saying, I was writing many years ago, but I didn't know that there was an answer to this schizophrenia, the capitalist for elite and socialism for the mass, meaning that we are under total control. And even if we want to challenge the system, economically speaking, and with rational arguments, most of the population, they will react emotionally, and they will not understand the concept of Douglas. We talk about the concept of the gap. Filling the gap with debt is immoral. But today, people, they're born and they expect that mortgage is a normal condition. My father never had a mortgage. And one day when I had my first mortgage, I still remember, he said, "Are you sure you want to do this?" And he didn't know the system. He didn't understand the purpose of credit or unlimited credit. I think up to a certain point, we all fell for this nonsense. And immigrants, they arrive here, they don't understand this. We cannot count on them to understand the concept of Douglas. It's much too abstract for them. For them, it's like, wait. The system gives me $3,000 per month. I will vote for a donkey. As a matter of fact, they're all donkeys, but that's another question. Up to a certain point, they will not be empowered, or they will not be aware. That would be one of my questions toward what strategy we would be able to implement as social creditor to reach those people, to explain to them that even if they receive money from the system, that money is virtual. It can disappear tomorrow with digital ID or CBDC, where you will have an expiration date on your token. We are on a very dangerous slope, actually. Most Canadians are not aware, and not only Canadian, most people are not aware of what is happening.
So a few points that you made there that I'd like to speak to. First of all, I think a well-fed slave is still a slave, and that's what we have in a lot of instances. So a lot of people that think they want a socialist or a UBI system, they don't realize that that's going to be likely contingent upon your behavior and your adherence to the party orthodoxy. But another thing, it's like you were mentioning, your wife is from Russia, and she's a Russian. She's a citizen in Canada, but she's still a Russian. And it's this double standard you see with Western migrants. You could come from Africa, South Asia, any part of the world. And if you get in here on a student visa and you get to extend it, you're now like a Canadian, and that's normal. Like that's nuts to me, man. I don't understand that, and I think there's a lot of pressure, and I think a lot of people, just that social pressure or the stigma of speaking against it keeps them in their lane. A lot of Canadians that think, well, that's not right. You're clearly not a Canadian. Like, how can we use that term so casually, considering what we're seeing? But again, you see all these people that are really feeling societal pressure relative to the stigma to adhere to that. Do you have any thoughts regarding that, Oliver?
Well, I think we might segue a little bit into something else that we were going to discuss. You're quite right. You know, when you bring in massive numbers of people, different language, different culture, different expectations, different software, like psychological software, you're going to end up causing a lot of conflict. You're going to balkanize the country, which is an unwise thing for any country to do. But you also end up threatening the indigenous, let's say, because they're threatened now with displacement, right? The world had a certain architecture, and now it's kind of it's dissolving, it's falling apart, and the threat is greater in those countries that have the deepest roots, like for example in European countries. There are many legitimate concerns here that you know, the fallout of these sorts of policies. But when this happens, then of course you're going to start to get pushback. So in all countries, I think it's a bit of a network. You have groups that are coming to the fore now who are opposing mass migration. It's a bit of a Johnny come lately thing because this has been going on for decades. But they're calling for remigration. In some cases, what they're calling for seems to be quite extreme, like even deporting, let's say, 10 million people from Canada, people who are citizens who would be denaturalized and things like this. And I think people have to start to think critically and start to think deeply about all of this. There is the phenomenon of the Hegelian dialectic, right? So thesis, antithesis, synthesis, or has been, you know, popularized problem, reaction, solution. None of these groups, whether in Canada or elsewhere, are actually throwing a spotlight on the real causational factors that involve finance. That's not on their radar at all. And what they're calling for is so unreasonable and outlandish that it can actually only be used to further the let's say the globalist agenda, right? So if because certain groups are calling for, you know, remigration of 10 million people, whatever, if there's social conflict, even if God forbid there's some sort of violence, then that gives the powers that be a pretext to introduce hate crime legislation, you know, surveillance, all sorts of policies to try to force people to live together harmoniously. And when we lose those freedoms, it will become more and more difficult actually to throw a light on what's really going on and what the real solutions to all of this happen to be. So, you know, people, unfortunately, maybe they don't know the history of things that have gone on before. We did have a video that we were going to pull up. We were going to show the video, but we just want to reference it. There was a group in Canada in the late 80s, 1990s called the Heritage Front. And it was led in part by a fellow called Grant Bristow. And it turns out, the Fifth Estate from the CBC did an expose on this. It turns out that he was a CSIS informant. And he ended up, in his capacity as an informant on this group, he ended up doing things that he shouldn't have been doing. He went beyond what the guidelines were. But, you know, people should be wise and realize that it's, you know, if you look at various groups and various individuals, you have to ask who is funding them, who's behind them, what are their real objectives? Are there intelligence agency connections or, you know, state connections here, or are there maybe big corporate private connections. We don't. If you don't want to be played, you've got to do a bit of digging, and you've got to ask these questions.
Yeah, I think this dialectic is relevant. When you look into color revolution tactics, there's something specifically called the strategy of tensions, and it's reflexivity between sides. So there's that reaction and then the counter reaction, and they like to control this. So it's like I said, the thesis and the antithesis, and then they keep us in this perpetual synthesis, and that's kind of how they herd us in many ways with this left-right, what I call a slave dialectic. But even if a lot of these groups aren't totally directly funded, they're being useful to further this agenda. They're reacting to something in a very predictable way that the ruling class is going to utilize to their advantage. And I fear, as you do, that the only way this can end is in some kind of physical unrest. The number one causation for destabilizing a society is radical demographic replacement. And we're seeing that. And it's not like the indigenous population, it's the homogenous population. When you've had a historically homogenous country and you influx, for whatever the underlying reason is, when you influx that many people from different cultures and incongruous cultures with us and each other, like we have tribal conflicts from India being fought in the streets of Brampton. Like we're in a bad way with a lot of this. But you have to think, like, if some of these groups aren't directly funded by various interests, I mean, are they just useful pawns in this whole agenda? And I feel for some of them because they have genuine concerns. They're looking again in this very hyper fixated myopic view, focusing solely on immigrants without the causational aspect, which is seemingly the most crucial aspect. But I think that's super relevant to mention. What are your thoughts on this, Andre?
Oliver was mentioning this CSIS agent and how they easily infiltrated, political movement or activist movement whatsoever. I still remember 1970, the October crisis in Quebec, where the RCMP was infiltrating the Parti Québécois movement, or the party. It was a political party at the time. And with the October crisis, 400 people were put in jail without a warrant, without a trial, without even an apology. And when you think of this, it's a classic tactic to do this. The other thing that I want to mention is the concept of the Great Replacement. Renaud Camus, who is a French intellectual, wrote a book called The Great Replacement in 2012, and at the time, everybody start to attack him from the left and or the side of the political spectrum. Everybody attacked him, and he was just referring to why do we have so much immigrant, and everybody was arriving with an easy answer. All those groups who are advocating for mass migration, usually they are either weaponized or not clever enough to know that they are manipulated and used by a system. Let's forget about the oligarchy or the cartel. Let's say the system. Even bureaucrats are instrumentalized for many reasons, and they're playing the game. You need only one. You need to remove one card, so the deck of cards will just collapse. One card. You just need to remove the right one. When the Soviet Union, the wall, the fall of the Berlin Wall arrived, nobody was expecting this, or maybe the CIA was expecting it, but this is another question. I think people are weaponized. They're not. I don't say they're not intelligent. They're not aware. They just know that they just don't understand the political aspect of our time, and they're trying to simplify it so they can live their own life and do not create anxiety. Many immigrants are in fear of speaking. I know a lot of immigrants from Russia, Ukraine, Lebanon, Italy, and even Italy. It's quite interesting because Western country, you say, okay, they don't talk about politics. They're afraid to express their opinion, and this is where you can control them. The system can control them, manipulate them, orient them according to their policies, and the more they will create or the more they will create an environment that is not stable, the more they will create anxiety. Revolution are based on that. Permanent revolution this is an expression that I heard the first time in 1997. Permanent revolution, meaning you're always in a state of anxiety. You can never rest. You can never build. There's no stability. And look at the financial system. It's always inflation, deflation, recession, growth every 5-7 years, and after that, people cannot build a sustainable future. There's no such thing as a sustainable future when you have this type of political manipulation. Immigrants, when they flood literally a territory, they create that ethnic conflicts. This is not new. That's why we have borders and sovereignty. And this is why I was saying at the beginning of the show, United Nation, either we have sovereign nation or we don't. We cannot have both.
I firmly believe that there's domestic psyops occurring in the Western nations. I think likely from CSIS and the Canadian government. And I think it's to the extent where it's social conditioning and there's social engineering occurring to keep us in this like false binary, especially, and I've mentioned this before, but it's relevant, especially the socialism versus capitalism model. The only way you could have rational individuals making a case for what we're calling capitalism, the current state of our markets and our systems, would be to contrast it with socialism. That naturally they're kept in that box, in that very parameterized view. So I think that's definitely a big problem. And I think it's like hyper normalized, some of the corruption of our system, and we can't see the change anymore. It's like you'll hear someone in the West, yeah, I'm super pro free market capitalist guy. You know, I love freedom. It's like, well, what did you do last week? Well, I worked 50 hours in a factory. It's like, well, that's, go freedom. What are you getting for all your labor? Well, I'm barely able to scrape by and pay my rent and bills each month. It's like, so you're running full steam and you're not making any progress. It's like, go freedom, right? Like we have to ask some fundamental questions like, what is freedom? And in the West, we've seemingly conflated it with consumerism and debt slavery in some very real way. So I think that's relevant as well. What are your thoughts, Oliver?
Well, I was thinking you could pull up that article from Socred just to give viewers sort of some reference, where they can go if they want to learn more about the Douglas social credit take on migration and how it would solve the whole issue. That's an article that I wrote about 10 years ago, actually. And this is, before we started seeing the extreme levels of mass migration into Canada. So it's before COVID. And it's all there. I mean, this information's been in the public domain for a very, very long time. And, the solutions are there if people are actually interested in solutions. And it's just a matter of, I suppose what we're trying to do is to articulate what the real problems are, what the real solutions are as well, what's available to address these problems. And we want ultimately to resolve conflict. We don't want to amplify conflict. And
so where would I find the article on here, Oliver?
So I put it in the chat, but it's also in the Telegram.
Okay. 1 second.
Yeah. So you can pull that one up.
This is going to take me a moment if someone wants to fill.
Yeah. So mass migration, it's one of the problems that's bound up with the gap. And, we've talked about this, JP, how so many problems that we face, so many social problems we face. You name what the problem is. It could be an environmental problem. It could have to do with international politics. It could be an economic problem like constant inflation. It all has something to do with this problem of the gap. And the problem of the gap is not something that most people have even heard of or know anything about.
So yeah, definitely check out socred.com. and you could find all of these writings. It's a great resource for other links to information regarding it. And we always mention it. Usually we have a relevant video, but there's an animated series available on YouTube. Just do a search for Douglas Social Credit. There's 42 animated videos, and that's an excellent resource to learn a little more as well. But yeah, I'll throw it over to you, Andre. Actually, before I do, we have about 50 people watching. We're extraordinarily deboosted with this topic, especially. So if you guys could share this, it's very advantageous for us. Go ahead, Andre.
Oliver was mentioning the gap, and that this gap is quite old. If we go back to national debt, the debt of Canada started to increase exponentially in 1972, 1973, after when they abandoned the gold standard. Before that, they were able to compensate, and mass migration was not an issue because you had growth in the society. Maybe the question of growth, we can talk about it in another episode, but when you look at what happened in the last 100 years, and I mentioned 100 year, 2026, let's say 3 years. Jose Ortega y Gasset, who was a Spanish philosopher, wrote an essay in 1929. The title is The Revolt of the Mass. And he was explaining how in 1929, just at the beginning of the Great Depression, how people were abandoning their moral code, and they were empowered with what you were calling, John Paul, freedom. I'm free to do whatever I want. And then after the war, 1945, the war effort, 1939, 1945, reconstruction of Germany, and all this labor that was needed to reconstruct after the war. People were very happy. We had the 30 glory years, 1945, 1975, where growth was there because we destroyed so much in 5-6 years that we were able to create a false illusion of prosperity. It was progress. If you bring the quote, John Paul, please, of Jose Ortega y Gasset, I will read it and just explain a little bit the concept. He was writing in his book, he said, everywhere the mass man has arisen, the mass man with whom this book is concerned, a type of man hastily constructed, built on a few abstraction, and who is therefore identical from one end of Europe to the other. That's important. This mass man, is a man emptied of his own history, without the entrails of a past, and who, by the very fact, is docile to all so-called international discipline. Rather than a man, it is a shell of a man. So he's always ready to pretend he's this or that. He has only appetites. He assumes only rights. He believes himself to be under no obligation. This is the man without the nobility that oblige, sine nobilitate, the snob. End quote. Two things. The first thing is he has no obligation, and he can be whatever he wants because they're all the same. You can just travel today and you go in an airport. It's always the same thing everywhere, the same shop. Everything is standardized, like nothing is different. And we are in this era. Gasset wrote this book in 1929, and we are displaceable. We can be removed or manipulated or displaced. David Orbach, who's an architect, French architect, in 2009, he gave a speech about the concept of container, house container. This is fascinating. He said why they're recycling old containers and they're building houses with them. And now architect, they're using this to model their new houses. Think about the housing promise of Carney. We will build millions of houses. Of course, if you have containers, it's quite fast to build houses. But that the ideological concept behind that is that you're merchandise and you can be displaced. because you're like your goods and services. We can displace you wherever we want, wherever we need you. Either it's to bring cheap labor or to create interior conflicts. We have this era. We are in this era now. And this is where I agree with you, John Paul. Most immigrants, they are victim of a system that oppressed them. And this system, what I call the end, the stage 4 of capitalism, is arriving at the end of his life expectancy, and it doesn't want to die. And it is becoming more and more ruthless because more and more people are waking up, especially with social media. Oliver always mentioned that if the system of Douglas would be known and understood properly, not necessarily in great details, but at least you understand that you cannot sustain infinite debt, eternal debt. You will fall and fail one day. If they would understand this, they would stop, like you said, John Paul, work 50 hours per week for what? Piece of bread. You cannot sustain it. Any economist today, any of them, from the left side of the political spectrum or the right side, they're all wrong because they do not look at empirical fact. Look at the fact. Don't just bring an ideology, Keynesianism, free market. It doesn't work anymore. But most people, they don't see it.
It's kind of like I was saying when I said we're being transformed from citizens of nations with history to like indentured employees. It's like we're witnessing the commodification of humanity en masse. They're turning us, and they are. Our nations where we once lived historically, to kind of reference E. Michael Jones, like where when people were living historically in their nations, it was a very different world. And what we're seeing now is again, it's more, a lot of people say, oh, it's socialism or it's communism. You hear this a lot, and I think that's so silly. We have a banking class that's transitioning our economies into like our nations into these perverse corporations. And I mean, they definitely don't want people living historically because they want that. They want this like transient class of indentured serfs, essentially. And that's seemingly the model that they're forcefully pushing us into. So very shortly, we're going to go over and transition to the question portion of the show. I will let Oliver speak to that topic first, but I would like to once again appeal to everyone to please share the stream. And if you have any questions, please leave them. There's no bad questions for this. We understand that this is brand new to a lot of people, so don't feel intimidated to ask a basic question. We'll be sure to get to it. So what are your thoughts, Oliver?
Another thing that we should sort of focus on or draw some attention to is the fact that, that mass migration on the levels that we're looking at, it's a feature of a Whig world, right? It's the world that Whiggery has given us, because in the mentality of the Whig, money is basically an idol, right? The whole financial system, the whole society, because of the way the financial system is structured, it's basically directed to the worship of mammon, right? Everything becomes a function of money, money values, money concerns, precisely because under the existing system, the real economy is not in the driver's seat. Finance is in the driver's seat, right? So we have to placate finance first, and then maybe we might get some of the real goods and services that we require. But from that point of view, if you live in a world that's dominated with that kind of mentality, well, culture doesn't mean anything, identity doesn't mean anything, and people are just regarded as interchangeable wage slaves or interchangeable debt slaves. And so we have to realize that we didn't get here where we are overnight. This has sort of been ideologically baked into the system baked into the civilization for a very, very long time. It's just the logical outcome, the inevitable outcome of the steps that we have been taking down this path. And without, if we don't decide to retrace our steps and take another path, there's no way that you can resolve the problem going along and doing the same thing that we've always done.
Well said. So that's going to bring us to our first question from Mr. J.C. Denton. This is for Oliver. Why did they crank up immigration after COVID? Conspiratorial or purely economic?
Okay, well, I don't think it was serving much of an economic purpose. I think, well, we could speculate all sorts of things. I mean, how many people were killed, let's say, as a result of the shots, or how many people were injured and unable to work? To some extent, migration might have been able to cover that. But I think what we've been seeing with the migration goes far beyond any palliative for COVID fallout. And what's really being aimed at is political destabilization, and it's occurring everywhere at the same time. If it was just occurring in Canada, you could say, well, maybe it's our dear leaders have some strange idea about what's in the best interest of the country, but it's happening everywhere. In Spain, in France, in Italy, in the United Kingdom, in Germany, and Sweden. So this is a policy that it probably serves multiple political objectives, but it's a policy that's being imposed everywhere, and the quantities involved now, it goes far beyond any sort of purely economic concern.
Yeah, I think that's the best argument to lend credence to the assertion that this is some kind of top-down imposition of an agenda. If it was just happening in Canada or even a couple of countries, you could say, well, maybe that's incompetent leadership. It's some kind of flaw of the actual ruling class of that nation. But the fact that it's happening broadly, no one was asking for it. No one was asking for the censorship. No one was asking for the carbon taxation. None of these things are popular. No one's lining up for data centers and flock cameras, but yet we're seeing this agenda being imposed broadly. So I think that's definitely relevant. I also think, to answer the question, I think this was going on for many years. I think at least since the 70s, when you first started to hear multiculturalism, which is a misnomer. We could have a multiracial or multi-ethnic type of a country with a national identity, but you can't have a multicultural country. That's just a destabilization tactic. So I think it was a long-term imposition of an agenda for sure. What are your thoughts on that one, Andre?
Yes, you mentioned 1970s, 1972, 1973, the Club of Rome, for example, or the rise of international institutions, United Nations after the Second World War, World Health Organization, Gavi, all those organizations that were implemented, I'm sorry to say this, by United States. And you fast forward to 2019, and then you realize that maybe the shot was supposed to kill millions of people according to the models, and it did not happen. For, let's say, 5-10% of the population started to kick back, and people were taking one shot, two shot, but it doesn't go fast enough. So they said, how we will be able to sustain the system, just sustain the system, low skill jobs. But I'm sorry to say this, you cannot, even if you're a lineman for a public utility, electric public utility, you still need skills. And we're seeing we're seeing now with the new generation is the total collapse of skill with younger generation. Either they are from Canada, let's take Canada, for example, or from immigration. It's not because they're incompetent, not because they're not intelligent. They're incompetent because the educational system has completely collapsed. Everything is collapsing in every domain. And because the monopoly on the economy creates scarcity everywhere, now we're forcing people to choose. Will you Will you save grandpa, or will you condemn grandma? Will you choose between feeding your child or paying your rent? They're pushing the boundaries so far. And one philosopher in France said one day, the ruling class always play one game, one shot too many. And after that, they hell unfolds. It's either revolution, interior conflicts, civil war. That's not what I'm advocating, but let's look at history. It's always what is happening. I don't know. I don't think that it would be different today, except that today it will be much more bloody.
So we have Jose Bernier watching. He says, hello. Hello, Jose.
Hello, Jose.
And he also says, you guys rock. So we appreciate the support. Please ask a question, Jose. And we have one from Bob Lior. Was Orage overly pessimistic? The Douglas positive proposals were as impeccable as his analysis, only they could not be carried into effect owing to the stupidity of the community that needed them. So we'll start with you, Oliver.
Well, I think I will side with Andre on this until we have evidence to the contrary. It's one thing to say that, why don't we have Douglas social credit? Well, it's because the general population is daft. How many people in Canada know of Douglas social credit? What percentage of the population actually has a decent understanding of it? It would be very, very, very small. So until everybody has had an opportunity, it's kind of like the gospel, right? Until everyone's had an opportunity to hear the good news of social credit and to respond to it appropriately, positively, I think it is perhaps a bit premature to declare that, people are just too stupid and there's nothing that we can do about that. Let's expose everybody that we can. And if we still don't get traction, well, then maybe then Orage is correct. But I'm betting that we can prove that he was being overly pessimistic.
Yeah, I think it's that Douglas social credit is the best kept secret in politics and in the economy as well. I was totally unaware of it before meeting you gentlemen and discussing it, traveling to Rougemont. I know Andre himself only came to it within the last year or so. So you think of all the potential Douglas social creditors. It's like you say, and I quote you frequently, the only reason there isn't tens of millions of Douglas social creditors is for the simple fact that they don't know that it exists. So that's what we endeavor to change with this program and our other shows and projects. So I will appeal once again. We have about 80 people watching. If you guys could please share this, like it, follow our social media accounts. It's very advantageous for us. I'll even push you a bit further and ask you to send this to someone that you think might enjoy this type of content. It helps us immensely. I'll send it over to you, Andre. What are your thoughts on the question?
Pessimistic, optimistic, or realistic? You have the choice. If you are pessimistic, you will see the world in black and you will not see what you can do personally. If you're optimistic, you don't want to see the problem and you try to live in an illusion, which is quite easy for the vast majority of people. Realistic means also Douglas system or Douglas doctrine needs a good understanding of the core, I would say, characteristic of the system. But people, they have to make a little effort. You can feed them and you can stuff them like goose. But what will happen? You will stuff their liver, and they will not be able to digest the core idea. And I say to people, many people, they don't do a budget today. It's like, at least start by doing a budget. Just, does your income match your expense? And if you're able to do this, maybe you will understand the concept of the gap. I don't say how you will fill the gap, because this is another issue. Because if you can balance your budget, the first thing you will ask your government is, why you never balance the budget? And then you will say, well, okay, we will balance the budget this year. We will cut, on social services. And says, will you repay the debt one day? The answer will never come. So there's a big gap in the educational system. The gap is everywhere. And I think they understood that in 1920. They understood that. They understood that the system was not sustainable. And unfortunately or fortunately, Douglas was an engineer. He was basing his analysis on empirical fact, not emotion. And most people today are building their opinion on emotion. This is a challenge.
And it's on empirical fact, not on predicated on terrible mathematical models that project endless growth is a viable option. So we have a couple of quick comments. Ordo ab choa, that's order out of chaos in Latin, and problem reaction solution. I think that's fairly accurate. And now we're back to JC Denton with a question for Andre. Why do you think Germany supported the mass immigration in 2015? So we'll start that with you, Andre.
Angela Merkel was a Stasi spy. That explains a lot. When you're a spy, you have access to information. And she was from East Germany. And let's not forget, where do you start a system? You will have to try a system where the community is weak. You test. It's like, your guinea pigs. You will do a lab test. You will see if it works. The best place to do it was Germany, because Germany was the locomotive of European Union. The economy was flourishing, even if the European Union was collapsing under debt, huge debt. The growth in Germany was sustainable. It was 4 or 5%. So they said, we will try to flood the system with immigrants. And because the economy is very strong in Germany, but it did collapse in 10 years, even in 8 years. But I think the mass immigration did not start in 2015. I think it's in the plan or the agenda since many decades. Because when you flood a country with massive immigration based on false pretext, like, a low birth rate, we need the labor force. Behind that, you have a more, I would say, evil goals. Why you don't have a sustainable birth rate? 2.3 children by for each woman. Why you don't have this? 1960, the culture war, the sterilization, contraception, abortion. We have all those psyop or concept that trap, let's say, women in a system. And then when this was finished, they had to find another way to weaponize people. I think the idea of mass immigration can be also related to eugenism. You can go back in the 1920s. Huxley, you have many people who were eugenists, and they were advocating for a world that is sustainable, that we can control population. They were afraid of, birth rate. Those are all part of the plan. I think they tried in Germany, just like they tried a curfew in Quebec, which was the only place in America where we had a curfew during the COVID era, because the population was weak, and then they can test it there. If it works there, they will be implemented. They will be able to implement the system on a larger scale.
So I guess I'll go next. I ultimately think that our political class is not politicians in the traditional sense of the term. I think at this point, they're political constructs. They're there to kind of provide the bread and circuses to give the peasants the illusion of participatory governance. And I think like we do have representative government still. Unfortunately, they don't represent the people. That's just abundantly clear. So I think Merkel is no different than Keir Starmer or Macron or any of these individuals. And I even think it's on the other side. Like a lot of people see the right side of it as, look at Boris Johnson and all that he did. He carried on the exact same agenda. And that's what I think Pierre Poilievre is. And ultimately, I'll go as far as to say now that Trump seemingly is that too. These people, even if they had good intentions at one time, and that's questionable, I think it's just so corrupted. I think when they get in there, they're very much pawns of this broader system. And there's clearly the imposition of this agenda. And no matter if the people certainly don't seem to want it, but they're going to impose it on us. So I think it's just that we have political constructs. That's the era we're at. It's kayfabe, kind of like the WWE presently. So what are your thoughts, Oliver?
Yeah, I agree with you. I was going to say that Germany supported mass migration or embraced mass migration in 2015 because the forces that were responsible for destabilizing Libya, Syria, and other places in the Middle East are the same forces that control Germany behind the scenes. And so it was a way of killing two birds with one stone, right? The German people are not enemies of the Libyans or the Syrians or anyone else, and vice versa. They're just being played off against each other, and for all sorts of reasons, all sorts of objectives. So it's important to realize that contrary to liberal democratic theory, it is not now the case, and it's questionable whether or to what extent it was ever the case that the general citizenry was actually determining policy. There's so many examples in our quote-unquote democratic countries, going back many decades, where policy was imposed against the wishes of the population. There's nothing remotely democratic about that.
Yeah, I think that's just undeniable for sure. And that's an excellent point you brought up that I failed to consider. All of these various regime change wars and conflicts in these areas was definitely a big contributor to the mass migration we've seen, especially early on in Europe. It's kind of a direct consequence of it for sure. So we have another one from Mr. Denton. This is for Andre. Do you think the mass migration started in 2015 or in Yugoslavia with R2P?
Well, he's right, and he's right to refer to Yugoslavia, 1999. Serbia. The collapse of Soviet Union brought the destruction of Yugoslavia. In 1992 and 1999, you had the concept. I would say the attack from NATO on Serbia, with the concept of wow, it is so fascinating. R2P, right to protect, right to bring democracy. Okay, you don't have democracy, we'll bring it to you like it's a brand. Yes, it's a way to destabilize a regime. Don't forget one thing: we were not hearing this expression, regime change. We changed the language, we changed the vocabulary. Before it was a coup. We have a coup. It is the Praetorian Guard or people like the Russian Revolution. There was a Russian Revolution in February 1917, but after that it was a coup. But today we're using the expression regime change like it is normal. I think about Iran, for example, or Venezuela. So somebody arrives and says, "Okay, we don't like your leader. We will change it." That's it. No problem. What about democracy? Well, democracy, that's our democracy. So the mass migration is just one of their tools in their toolbox. They're using this, but they're using the structure of the ruling class. There's a small group of individuals who runs this planet. I'm sorry to say this. You can call them whatever you want, but they are lobbies, corporation, entities that are behind the scene and are manipulating people. The danger is in a totalitarian system, you don't have to rely on a very big police force. You can rely on your neighbor who will spy on you. This is how Soviet Union. Read the origin of totalitarianism from Anna Arendt. She's explaining this very well in one chapter. How, for example, you have two policemen from the Cheka with each, and they all have a machine gun, and they're bringing 100 men to the Gulag, and nobody thinks about, we are 100, they are two, and we could empower them, and we could just neutralize them. But everybody's complying. In a totalitarian regime, your neighbor can become a spy. So you live in anxiety and fear. This is why I was referring to permanent revolution. When you change the goalpost all the time, people become anxiety. They have anxiety and they don't know how to react. Today, we have this since Yugoslavia is a good example, but it's not a new concept that was used many times by the secret agent of the United States, and even either in Russia and China, it's the same thing.
I think it's an excellent point where you were mentioning in a lot of cases with totalitarianism. Number one, you can't comply your way out of totalitarianism, but it brings the worst out of people because there's a lot of people, and the only metric they can compete on is compliance to the regime, to the party. And they're the ones that are quick to pick up the phone and call the authorities on their neighbors. I heard a story, actually, I read in Michael Malice's book, The White Pill, and he was talking about after the Berlin Wall fell, a bunch of people got into the Stasi, the secret police office, and they thought initially maybe we could find out who was the informants and we can prosecute them. And then they quickly discovered that 60% of the population was informing on the other 40%. So this is a common feature of these societies. It absolutely brings the worst out of people. What are your thoughts, Oliver?
I think, the phenomenon of mass migration as we know it probably goes back to the time of the Second World War and the end of the Second World War. Hundreds of thousands, millions of people, came to Canada, came to the United States, went to various parts of South America because they were displaced as a result of the war. So had the war never occurred, that those mass movements would not have occurred either. And then even, in the 1950s, when things were a little more stable, you had, for example, in Germany, you had Gastarbeiter, guest workers who were coming from Turkey and other places to work in Germany. Why? Because Germany was booming. Germany was growing. There was a lot of reconstruction that had to occur, of course. And under the existing financial system, the economy had to grow in order to maintain equilibrium. Otherwise, you end up with recession, economic slowdown. So people were being brought in, and it was the population, the German population, was told, well, they're just coming for a little while. They're guest workers, and then they will go back, after they've made their fortune or what have you. But of course, that in many cases did not happen. And I look forward to a world where you can raise the standard of living in Turkey to such an extent that Turks wouldn't want to go to Germany or anywhere else. They'd be happy in Turkey. The weather, I'm sure, in Turkey is better than it is in Germany. So it's been the gap in the centralization of power through finance has been such a destabilizing factor over so many decades, and it's implicated in the genesis of wars as well. That without, what I want to stress is without addressing the financial problem along Douglas social credit lines, you're just rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. You're just putting Band-Aids solutions on things, and you're not going to be able to prevent us from hitting the iceberg, so to speak.
Yeah, I think that's definitely right. So we have a comment from Debbie Fuller. Thank you all for bringing to the Canadian people. I'm trying to bring up DSC in casual conversations. My MLA has looked into it. Yes, Debbie, honestly, it's it absolutely shatters any preconceptions you had about the way everything was functioning. It allows you to see past a lot of these tricks that keep most of us enamored and trapped in this left-right thing, or this capitalism versus socialism thing. And I definitely like to hear that. And I will ask you, if you will, check out the 42 short animated clips on YouTube. It's just such a easily accessible resource for understanding this, because I know a lot of people aren't the type to read a 500-page book regarding social credit economics. I don't think people that advocate for capitalism or socialism would read a book on the macroeconomics regarding those systems. I just think that's the way. There's one of those books there. But with that said, there is a lot of resources that don't require the commitment of reading a book. I know, unfortunately, a lot of people won't read. So these short animated clips on YouTube, just do a search for Douglas Social Credit. It's great. It's a really good way to learn. So with that said, we're pretty much towards the end. I think we have one more question here. There we go. Another one from Mr. Denton. What is the Douglas Social Credit view towards handouts to temporary foreign workers / newcomers? So I'll start with you, Oliver.
The Douglas social credit view towards handouts. I wonder exactly what sort of handouts he's thinking of. But, if you're talking about what life would be like in a Douglas social credit system, we wouldn't have temporary foreign workers. And we wouldn't have mass migration either. There would be no need for it. If you're asking about, the system as it is and what's going on, well, this is sort of a necessity of the existing system, but it's replete with injustices. It's replete with all sorts of ironies, and this is what you start to get these sorts of entropic symptoms. It's like the progress of a disease. You start, because you haven't dealt with the causal issue, the real core cause of the disease. You end up with all these manifestations of illness, and should we treat the illness this way or that way? But if we do this, it's going to cause these other problems, or it's going to make this group of people rightfully angry, so on and so forth. It's just the sort of the apotheosis of entropy. Right. And so there are many things going on that I don't agree with, that I don't like, but there's really not much point complaining about it if people are not looking or not willing to look at, well, what's really driving this, which is the gap and the centralization of power, and what should be done to address that.
And that's honestly why I wanted to revisit this topic, because so many people get lost in this very myopic perception of this problem, and they fail to even acknowledge the causational aspect. And that's our current system with its deficiencies. It necessitates bringing in the mass migration. It's just by its very nature. But to answer the question directly, it's like you said, there would be no temporary foreign workers, nor would there be any handouts. There would be, everyone would have their stake in the national production of the country with a national dividend and a compensated price discount. So I mean, it's a paradigm shattering type of a situation. Like, you can't just put it in any preconceptions. And that's why, I mean, it's very important for people to actually look into it to get a bit of a better understanding. What's your response on that one, Andre?
Well, one thing, like I was saying, we're all globalists. A couple of weeks ago, I was saying we're all globalists, so we have to think globally. And it doesn't mean that we can move easily. But what Oliver was mentioning about Germany 1950, the guest worker, meaning that you're invited. I invite you for supper and you start to criticize my food, I will say, well, I will not invite you again. So when you compare the expression foreign worker or temporary foreign worker with what was happening in 1920, we didn't have this type of mass migration. So I think in the mind of Douglas, it was not an issue at the time what happened with the monopoly of credit and the gap that is never filled, except from debt or many, are artifact. You would not be in a way in a position where you would have mass migration or temporary foreign worker. You would not need to replace your labor force with a foreign worker, maybe because you would have a sustainable birth rate. This brings many aspect, theological aspect and philosophical aspect that many people don't want to address because they are difficult. Why we don't have a sustainable economy based on birth replacement rate? No growth means you have a good replacement rate. You have people who age, decay, and die, and you have a stable society. This is not what we're saying, and what we're seeing everywhere. The structure of the system needs to displace people, so it can create an illusion of fairness, if I can say. If I refer to the pact for migration or the right for mobility, I don't want to be mobile. When I'm 20 years old, I would like to discover the world, to travel, to have enough income to flourish, work, and if I have to, and contribute to my the growth of the economy of my country. But I don't want to be in this position forever. After a certain time, I want to build a family and live in a sustainable environment. That's not what we're seeing actually. I think in the idea of Douglas in 1920, from what I know, I think the problem was not very well identified because it was practically not there, except for displacement because of war, or the idea of what was called developing, the American way. People were immigrating from Europe because they were seeing freedom in America. I think the book of Michael Jones, Walking with a Bible and a Gun, is explaining very well how people were perceiving America as the land of the free and the home of the brave. Well, that had a limit because one day you arrive and you say there's no more room or territory to develop. Now we have to create scarcity to be able to control people. That was what Douglas saw. The idea of scarcity is a false problem.
So that brings us towards the end. Before we go, I would like to mention an event that's coming up. Let me just zoom in on this a little bit. Well, evidently, I cannot zoom in on it. But this is the annual meeting of the Pilgrims of St. Michael, and we're actually going to be debuting the new documentary by director Jason Dahl, screenwriter / producer William Waite, and producer Oliver Heydorn, our very own. And myself, Andre, and Oliver will all be there. Andre and I will be doing a presentation, and it's a whole week. It's September 23rd to 28th. So if anyone will be in the area of Rougemont, which is just outside of Montreal, it would be an excellent opportunity to come in and learn with the Pilgrims, who were kind of, I mean, since when? The 1940s, really pushing Douglas social credit and Catholic social teaching. So it's an excellent opportunity if anyone wants to come out and learn more. And also, before we go, I would like to mention that we have Social Credit Voices at a special time on Tuesday at 4 p.m. with the writer of the documentary, Will Waite. That's 4 p.m. Eastern. And then we have a regular scheduled episode on Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern, and that's with Christian Schramm. So we got a lot coming up in the future. I want to give you gentlemen your last words, and then I'll say goodbye. I'll start with you, Oliver. Do you have any parting thoughts?
Well, we could summarize everything we've talked about by saying, there are many problems that we face, many social problems we face, but surprisingly, a lot of these problems come down to one cause, which is the gap. And Douglas social credit is the only thing out there that identifies the gap and promises to address it appropriately.
Well said. Andre, do you have any parting words?
Come and visit us in Rougemont. We can have a chat live in person. and debate.
That's honestly your best bet. So with that said, I want to thank everyone for watching and interacting. We have about 80 people. The suppression on this show cannot be understated. We were getting about 500 live viewers initially. We're about 11, 12 episodes in now, and we're just totally deboosted. So if I can appeal one more time, we do get most of our views after the live broadcast. Please give this a share, a like, and follow, and all of that fun stuff. And we will see you guys next week, Monday at 7 p.m. Eastern. Cheers.